Hi, everybody.
Well, welcome. We are glad to have you here, and we are recording the conversation now, just so you know, for our class archives and potentially for our Creative Writing YouTube channel. So we are excited to talk to you today about lots of things, but in particular, your role in founding and running and curating Talking Writing, and your take on craft articles. And you mentioned that you typically solicit those, so we're wondering how you choose your themes, and then how you choose the writers, and also what happens if you get a solicitation that you're not crazy about. How do you deal with that?
Those are a
So
lot of questions.
I
That's great.
know. So you can talk to any of those, and then everybody will have other questions as well. So.
Okay. Hmm. I guess let me talk a little bit first about the founding of Talking Writing and how I even decided to get involved in a venture like that, or to create a venture like that, because it was, I won't say that it was just happenstance, but um, it evolved as things went along. It was not something that I like made some kind of plan about and like, oh boy, I really need to do this to set up my platform and all that kind of stuff. It kind of evolved out of the work I had just begun doing as a journalism instructor at Harvard, and the kinds of questions that were coming up in the magazine writing class that I was teaching at the time. And it's funny because that was, way back when, like in 2008 and 2009, and that feels like about 1,000 years ago in terms of what's been happening with digital media and digital sites, and certainly with what's been happening with literary magazines. Um, but it began as sort of a group blog, partly not started by my students, but partly to address some of the questions that my students had at the time about, and many of them were journalism students. So, as I'm sure you all know, journalism is undergoing a complete transformation over the past decade, and so even back then, which is about a decade ago, many of them are wondering about, well, how do I sell magazine articles, or how do I get my voice out there, or how do I get a job as a journalist? So there were a lot of questions like that. That's where it came out of. But over about the course of the year of doing this blog with some other writers and addressing, at the time we were mostly addressing craft issues, um, decided with my co-founder Elizabeth Legacy that we would start a magazine, and there really is a difference between a magazine and a blog, although and it seems more obvious now, I think, but at the time it took some convincing to make clear to people that we were not just doing a blog anymore, that we were in fact doing a professionally juried and edited magazine. And I think one of the things that really is the distinguishing hallmark of a magazine is that it is edited. Now, there are different definitions of editing, of course, and I come out of mainstream magazine publishing, and actually academic publishing as well. So my background is there, and so I've been and still am a journalist, off and on, and so journalists are really used to being edited a lot by editors. So I went into this enterprise along with Elizabeth too, who had done a lot of editing. We were assuming that we were not only going to be selecting pieces to be in the magazine, but also working, especially with prose writers, on editing their pieces and making them better. And better is in the eye of the beholder, but there are certain journalistic standards for that. So that's how it began, and we ended up becoming a 501c3 public charity, so we are a nonprofit organization. Most of what we do now is based on donations, And so we are operating at a shoestring, but it is really quite amazing what you can accomplish, even as an independent magazine, um, for not much money online. I mean, it's actually kind of amazing to me in many ways that we can do what we do now um, with a very, very small budget. I mean, I do pay some freelancers to do administration and production and some of the things that go into doing a digital magazine, but most everything is based on volunteer efforts. So it's that's something of the model now, unless a magazine is affiliated with a university.
Mhm.
So so anyway, that's a start, and then I'm happy to speak to other questions. Uh, or at least I think I forgot some of your questions,
No,
Katie.
that's fine.
So please pose them again. I'm happy to take any of them on.
Well, I'll let the students offer some questions, and then if there's anything at the end that I might add some in. But yeah, what questions do you have for Martha?
I'm going to repose one of Katie's questions. What do you do if you solicit a craft work and then what you receive is not pleasing to you?
Okay. Well, first of all, I don't really solicit that many craft pieces, at least not anymore. Uh, but for anything that I solicit now, if it's prose and if I see that there's a good core to the piece, I will work with that writer to improve it in various ways. Now, what happens when what happens when we solicit pieces is that usually we're working with writers that we've worked with before. So I have a pretty good sense of what's going to come in. Every once in a while, I will solicit work from somebody I haven't worked with before, but they've been doing a lot of writing. I have sort of a certain kind of expectation. Um, I mean, the other part of what we do is I'm very interested in personal takes on anything, be it craft or a reporting assignment or anything else. So the biggest thing that I'm often working on with people who send me a craft piece is make this personal. Tell me your story. Don't just give me 3 tips for how to get over writer's block. I mean, there are so many different pieces like that out there. They're not interesting. I mean, all of the in many ways, craft articles for writing and literary writers and even for journalists are they're sort of like the what I'd call the evergreen topics. um, there's not really that much new under the sun. So it's not like you're talking about something particularly new. What's new is your own perspective, your own story, your own, what you bring to it. And then it becomes, for me, more than just a craft article. It becomes something that is also a personal essay, something that is exploring this writing challenge, because writing is very, very challenging. It's always challenging. I'm always happy to look at pieces that take a fresh new angle on writer's block, for example. But if it's not personal, if it's not vivid in various kinds of ways, it doesn't have a wonderful, wonderful, unique voice, and by voice I mean way of observing the world. Um, I don't feel like there's, at least we're not the venue for that kind of piece. So did I answer that question? I hope I did.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
It's a heartening answer.
Oh, is it? Good.
Yes.
Why? What? Tell me why it's heartening.
Well, because I feel like we've been discussing removing the personal from particularly craft essays, because it seems self-indulgent or narcissistic or something. So I like that there are venues where one is encouraged to insert oneself into the piece. So.
Well, I don't know if Katie has heard my complete diatribe against that kind of attitude about, sort of whether it's an academic essay or a canned journalistic feature. But I mean, one of the classes I teach now is first-person journalism. I'm very, very interested in that. I actually think readers are too. I mean, I've been a magazine editor for a long, long time, and sure, readers want information, but really, you can Google and find out how to pitch a magazine article, how to do this, how to do that. It's there's like endless sites for this. From Writer's Digest on down. There are many, many different kinds of ways to get that kind of information or to get the basic tips. But for literary writers in particular, I think what's interesting is this sort of unique view you have of the world, and ability to describe what you see and to describe both your internal states and what that is like for the larger world as well. I mean, that's to me, that's what makes for good writing. So I'm glad you're hardened. I mean, I'm oftentimes, arguing with people about this, but, I run my own magazine, so I can, these days I can do what I want, which is nice.
We were looking at the guidelines that the Writer's Chronicle has for these kinds of articles. And so one of the things we were talking about is, when to put the I in and when not to, right? And they have this very clear, what's that line? Oh gosh, I should probably read it out so you can hear what we're looking at. The Writer's Chronicle says, in writing essays on craft, writers are often tempted to use their own work as an example. The editors do not welcome such articles. Right, and so part of what we're talking about is venue, is where to pitch what kind of article, whatever they're ending up writing, where does it belong, where is it home? So
yeah, I mean, that's I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you any kind of definitive answer to that, but what I will say is that there are lots of digital outlets now that are good outlets for this kind of stuff, for very quirky kinds of things. I mean, the Writer's Chronicle, that's the AWP magazine, right? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, they're still kind of lost back in, academic land or whatever. I mean, I understand what there's, I mean, they do pieces that use the I voice. I understand what they mean by they don't want somebody that's just using their own work as an example, because that means it feels like self-promotion, I think,
Right.
from their point of view.
Mm-hmm.
That said, though, we do, we still do articles that are sort of why I write articles, which always involve a writer kind of talking about their own work, and there's a distinction between it being PR and genuinely grappling with the difficulties of writing. So I think some of those are some of our best pieces. We have an annual spotlight on writing and faith. In fact, we're running a contest right now on personal essays for that, and those are some of the best pieces in our magazine every year, and those are essays that go deep. They oftentimes are looking not only at someone's faith, but how do you grapple with what you believe and put it into words. And many times those have to be personal examples. It's what you're working on, it's your writing, it's your experience, it's your material.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, but I think you will find other venues for out there. It's like I know they exist, and maybe one way to think about craft articles is to think of them more as, maybe you want to pitch them more like personal essays, or think of them more as personal essays. And then I think where you can submit them broadens out.
Right.
That's I mean, that seems like a simple suggestion, but it can be helpful.
Yeah, definitely broadens the potential focus. Yeah, what other questions?
I had a question, sorry, with Kate's question and something you mentioned earlier, a phrase, certain journalistic standards for revision and for editing. And as someone who is a creative writer with no journalism background whatsoever, is there anything that creative writers should know about when they're doing these kind of articles, or anything that you see creative writers doing that you wish that they knew? Is some of the basics of journalism. I feel like I read a lot of journalism, but I've never been trained in that area. So that would be helpful.
Okay. So are you talking about doing like narrative nonfiction, that kind of literary nonfiction? Is that what you mean?
I mean, Sort of in this same, if I were pitching a craft article as a personal essay, for example, is there something, is there some journalistic bedrock that I should know about before I started pitching? Because this is very different than the kind of writing I normally would do.
Well, you'll get a different answer from me than you would from somebody who has a more creative writing focus, because I'm a journalist, and so I would say yes. I mean, I teach in a journalism program. I would also say that for anybody who really wants to be writing creative nonfiction and any kind of literary nonfiction, you should take a journalism class. And the reason for that is to learn how to handle sources and to learn how to handle research. I think that's the biggest thing that I'm oftentimes working on with our writers who are doing literary nonfiction. Many of them are quite experienced writers, but when they take on any kind of thing that involves information that's on the public record, they, I mean, it even comes down to things like, really trying to pin down just public events, talking about something that happened in 1978, and a writer will say something like, well, I think it happened in 1978. Well, if it's a public event, it's on the record, so go find out. I mean, really, truly. I mean, some of it is really that basic. And so if you're submitting to creative writing focused kinds of journals, they won't push you as hard about stuff like this. But as a journalist and as somebody who actually cares a lot about accurate information, especially the way it's used online, I really do believe that anybody that's writing nonfiction should know how to handle sources, know how to verify them, know how to attribute them. Those are the sort of, that's journalism 101, verification and attribution. I mean, does that help? I can say more. I mean, you can get me to crank up on this if you want. I can go into high dudgeon, but I mean, I actually think one of the most helpful things for creative writers who want to do nonfiction is to just take a journalism class. I mean, I have lots of creative writers in my journalism classes.
Okay, that is really helpful. Thank you.
If we can't take a journalism class,
yes,
is there like a primer you could recommend?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, or I don't know, like a podcast or something.
Not a
Or is that
podcast.
just taking the shortcut?
No.
Yeah.
Well, funny you should say that, but I will tell you the book that I use in my first person journalism class. I use Philip Lopate's To Show and to Tell. And it's a series of essays by him, sort of reflecting about different issues in writing nonfiction. And it's great. My students love it, journalists are not. It's not a sort of a guide to doing specific things. It's more his reflections. Each one is an essay, and he, of course, is very, very gifted essayist himself. So I think that's a great book to look at. Other ones, when it comes to handling sources, that's a harder thing, because then there actually aren't that many things out there about this that are like, trade books that you can find out how to handle this. Maybe someday I'll write this book, but it's really, they're not a lot. I mean, the best one I've found is that one by Lopate for the particular class I'm doing. And because he worked, I mean, I remember talking to him about this, and he said, I said, I use your book. It's actually been great in my class, because I love one of the things he does so well is that, he worked as a journalist too. He makes clear that when you use the I voice, it's not just about creating a narrative character. There are actual facts in your life that affect the story you're telling. And if you don't reveal sort of key, sort of what journalists would call orienting details, who, what, where, when, that kind of stuff. If you don't reveal them, then readers have no idea who the I voice is, especially in a personal essay. So that's, I think that's an excellent book. And I essentially agree with his take, especially when it comes to literary nonfiction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. So I'm currently in a creative nonfiction class right now, and we've read different texts, some where the authors present a very comprehensive view of the research, like all of the facts or all of the details, or as much as they could get into the text. Others have amended or cut back on a lot of it and only provided little bits here and there, kind of constructing the characters through what they present. I was wondering, in your opinion, your personal opinion, maybe of others in the field as well, what makes for a more compelling read? One where there is just little bits of information with maybe more character buildup, or the ones that do include the more comprehensive background of the research?
Well, that's another really, really good question. All these questions are great. That's hard because when you're talking about a compelling read, some of it has to do with who your reader is and where you're publishing. You know, some of it has to do with that. You have to kind of figure out, well, who am I addressing? I think literary readers would tell you very different things than many general readers, and certainly different things than a journalist would tell you. So I'll try to bring all those things in. My basic interest is in engaging general readers, or at least readers who might be interested in literary work or long form features or things like that, but aren't necessarily creative writers, or they have more general background, or academics or anything like that. And I think those readers do need to know where information comes from. Now, there are clunky ways to get that in, and journalism is known for all the many clunky ways it gets that in. But there are also other ways that you can convey things. And one of the reasons why I teach first-person journalism, and why I think that the first-person voice is useful for certain kinds of journalistic features, is that you really can take readers along on your journey of figuring out how you know what you know. And given the response now of many people to news and what's fake and what's not fake and how can I trust that, it is actually pretty important to get readers to trust you as somebody, and in some ways using the first person voice and showing what you know as well as what you don't know makes you far more trustworthy as a voice than sort of the sort of classic omniscient reporting voice, or the sort of more literary approach where there's not enough information given to the reader about where things come from. They sometimes are not even told that names have been changed, or that quotes have been massaged, or that you've got composite characters, or any of those things. All of those kinds of things that I just mentioned, and include, or changing the chronology of what happened so to create a better story. All those kinds of things are actually not acceptable in journalistic narratives. So that's what you've got to weigh. You've got to weigh what your audience is and what impact you want to have with a given piece that you're writing. But I will tell you, as somebody who's interested in accurate information and what general readers want, and my sense of what's going on out there, that telling them where you get information is better than not telling them. Even if it's like sometimes, what a lot of narrative journalists do is they'll put a top note to explain where things came from. Like in, and I think about Catherine Boo's Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, which is a beautiful work of narrative journalism. Lots and lots of scenes with her sources, and she has both, in that book she has I think an opening that explains how she did the research, and then lots and lots of information at the end, and also on a website about how that research was done. I think if you just tell readers, hey, this is kind of how I did things, that's one approach. That is one approach, and then you can get into the story. But however you do it, they want more these days. They want to know how you know what you know. I'm not sure how to put that in any other way, but I think it's true.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question. It's very general and vague. I'm going to ask you anyway, because I think you're a good person to ask. So you're talking about being, you didn't use this term, but being an expert or at least a seeker about what is of general interest to the reading public. And I am a poet and I'm trying to write personal essays now. And my question is, what is of general interest to the reading public? Because when you're using the I voice in prose, I think you need some guidelines about that, because your life is interesting to you, right? And your perspective is interesting to you. But I think there are probably guidelines. And as a poet, I'm really not sure what is interesting to other people, truly, because I do read lyric poetry a lot and find it compelling. So any observations or just things that popped into your mind from your experience, I'd be interested to know.
Okay. You guys should all take you should take my first person journalism class. It is
We'd love to do that.
It is mostly a
Finally.
distance class. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
It's not for lack of interest.
all right. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I think I can answer this from the perspective, a general perspective of a magazine editor.
Yeah.
That everything in the world is interesting. You just have to make it interesting to people. I mean, that's the thing. What I really encourage my students a lot, and we're actually right in the point in my current session of this class where they're pitching ideas and getting feedback from other students about their ideas and sort of developing them. We spent a lot of time on that, actually. And that's because it's helpful to hear what other people think. So one of the things I've always recommended to students who want to write either personal essays or features is, if you have an idea, talk it around with friends, talk it around with your family, bring it up at a party. If people are interested, they will instantly jump on it and start asking you questions. And, oh, I had this experience too. Though you'll be able to tell almost instantly if they're interested. If they're not, it's not necessarily, the idea isn't necessarily a bad one. It's that you haven't focused it yet. You haven't figured out what the hook is yet. From sort of a feature writing perspective, there is something of a formula for how you do engage readers. But I really do think anything can be interesting. What makes it interesting is the way you, the writer, think about it and present it to the reader. And, I have people in my class now that are writing everything from wrestling with their experiences of being an embedded journalist in Afghanistan with the military, and to wanting to write a piece about the fact that they hate it when people interrupt them. So all these things can be really, really interesting and lend themselves to nonfiction features or essays. So I would say for a poet, one of the things maybe you should do is think not just about the poetry you like, but what topics do you like? That's where it starts. If you're excited by something, other people will be excited. It's not, in this world of like freelance journalism and literary writing, there is really no point in trying to write what other people want, unless you want to be a full-time freelancer and want to sell your soul in a certain way. I really don't see there's any point to that. I think the point in terms of getting published and establishing a platform and all that kind of stuff is to write about things you care about. That is what people respond to. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think there's a notion, it's probably a pretty old school notion now of, like a reporter working for a paper and they get an assignment, like go out and cover the Little League game or go out and cover like the Yankees game or something like that. And there's that idea of like the reporter sort of working their way up through the sort of low stakes stories to like the big breaking news, and I mean, that's not our sort of focus here, right? I mean, when we write nonfiction, it's typically more personal, even though it does engage with the world, but the way that, the world is now, it seems like you're free from that right? I mean, if you're interested in Little League, then you can go cover it, you know, like if you're interested in you know, something international, you know, then that's, you know, you find your angle on it. So it's kind of a kind of freedom, but also a kind of free fall, not knowing necessarily where that will end.
That's a good way to put it, Katie. I think that basically one of the silver linings of journalism going through so many changes and that sort of old model you're talking about, it's not completely gone. It's just it's very hard for anybody to make a living. I mean, there are people, you know, I have students who are freelancers for various papers. Who have a beat and they're doing things like covering, you know, the college basketball games and things like that. They do that and they're able to make a living because they're, you know, writing, you know, 10 quick news reports a week or something. But those folks are also pitching longer feature ideas and want to do other kinds of writing too. For anybody who's working as a freelancer now, you do a mix of things, but it is very true that the biggest thing that has changed is the sort of idea that there was some kind of a track that you could go work at a magazine or a newspaper and learn the ropes. And well, a few people can do that, especially if they're somehow or other have elite connections or come from the Ivy League or have lots of money or something. Basically, that just is not happening anymore. I'm probably the last generation of people that came through magazine publishing where I actually was mentored on the job by other editors. And I think that doesn't happen very much anymore. And that's just because there aren't any jobs. And also it's you know, a lot of you know, mainstream magazine publishing is kind of a little elite bubble too. So. How about if I take one more question, and then I should
Sure.
probably
Yeah,
take.
absolutely. We're at the end of our time here too. So yeah, so what final question do we have for Martha? Craft.
I remember one from Katie's question dump. She asked about your magazine and how you are ultimately choosing your themes at this time and the direction that you take it. So what's that process like?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, part of it has changed some because we used to do more issues every year. So coming up with themes, I had to brainstorm with my managing editor and the poetry editor, and sometimes the fiction editor would be involved, and the various people that I would brainstorm ideas with, and we'd kind of come up with what they would be. At one point, we did a thing where we had donors vote on potential themes and chose one of our themes based on what they, you know, during our annual fundraising campaign. But that felt like too much work for the end result. So, and then inevitably we had people disappointed that we didn't choose the theme they wanted. So it was sort of like not the best strategy. But these days, we're doing basically 2 issues, and by issues they're sort of cycles of publishing because we are digital. So we've just begun our fall issue, and we'll be publishing pieces in that until the end of the year, and that's more nonfiction focused. And that theme I had another theme for it actually, and I came up with it after both, I think pretty much after the inauguration and then the AWP conference in Washington this year that was shortly after Trump's inauguration. And I just felt like the kinds of discussion happening at the AWP at that time were not getting at how we talk about truth telling. So our theme, our sort of broad theme we have is truth telling. And I really did put out a solicitation for first person journalism for this particular one, and also for pieces about how do we talk to each other. So that one is very topical, that particular theme. Our spring issue is poetry focused, and for that one, I usually weigh in, but the people that choose it tend to be Carol Dorff, our poetry editor, and Jennifer Jean, our managing editor. They're both poets, and they really pretty much run that issue. So even though I weigh in on it, we go back and forth, and we try to get something that is somewhat topical, because again, it's more of a hook for general readers. So next spring, we're going to be doing a spotlight on poetry that's about science and technology, I think. I mean, I'm not absolutely sure. That hasn't been pinned down yet, but that's what we're going to be doing. So it tends to emerge out of a sort of I come up with ideas, and then I send them around to various people. Sometimes I run them by my board members just because I want some feedback. But yeah, I just sort of tend to see some of it is about what interests me too, because I am the top dog here. So but I also run it by, and just as I was telling you that if you have an idea for something, you should run it by people. It's actually really important as an editor to run those kinds of ideas by people. That's actually one of the biggest difference between running a blog and running a magazine. A magazine is a collective of people. Even if there's one person in charge, it really is a group of people that are putting something together, and it's a group effort in that way. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. And it was a delight to see you all, even if only for a short time. And good luck with everything. Feel free to, you can always query me for free at Talking Writing ideas for features or essays. It's we do, like a lot of mainstream magazines, that focus on prose. We do give pretty quick feedback on whether an idea is good for us or not. So. Anyway, thanks very much.
All right, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.